research on like neuro response in grocery stores and like the layout of grocery stores, and they put people in VR in a grocery store and then put like a thing on their head to measure their neuro response.
Yeah.
And the findings that they got was people don't understand VR grocery stores. It's not at all like a normal experience to have a disembodied hand walking around a grocery store. And this new Apple and most VR, like I know that this is going to be such a big deal in like the, you know, communication science research community. And why we don't need a VR grocery store. This is just going to create things that don't need to be in VR are going to be in VR.
Right.
And I'm not thrilled about it.
The conference several years ago, UFVA, University Film Video Association, and there were, I guess I had missed what the trend actually was, because I was exhibiting, screening a film, but all my colleagues, it was all these VR films, you know, so there was all these pedestals with the goggles and Oculus and everything, and I'm just like, whoa. It's to speak to sort of taking over all of how we're going to screen movies.
It's just doing it because it's cool and not because we have to. And I'm like VR pessimist because it makes me motion sick. So I can't, like, even if I wanted to be into it, I can't because it makes me sick.
Yeah.
So maybe it is actually cool and I just don't know because it makes me sick. But
It seems to come back, like, I feel like every 5 years or so. It's been going on for decades. So people seem to get excited about it and then forget about it for a while.
When it's small,
remember
when it's sunglasses or
Yeah. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? We've got some students coming in as well. We have a couple folks joining through Zoom. So welcome. We're really glad to have you all here. We are incredibly happy to have Dr. Courtney Tabor joining us today. So Communication Studies is pleased to welcome Dr. Tabor as our finalist candidate for a position of visiting assistant professor of communication studies here at EOU, who's been asked to give a teaching demonstration. Dr. Tabor recently earned her PhD in communication and media studies from the School of Journalism and Communication at the University of Oregon. Her research background, publications, and expertise explore sociocultural and political questions around mass communication, democracy, and psychology, with particular investment in scholarship and understanding how, when, and why audiences consume political and entertainment content about crime and policing, and how this affects their opinions, beliefs, and behaviors. So we're incredibly grateful to have Dr. Tabor giving a teaching presentation with us, and we highly encourage you to attend for her research demonstration, which will be at 2 p.m. in Ackerman 104. So with that being said, take it away.
thank you. What an introduction. Did I write that or did you write that?
I fashioned together some of the things from your
Amazing. So thank you. Yes, my name is Dr. Courtney Tabor. I'm very excited to be here talking to you today, giving my teaching demonstration. I have a teaching background in media studies and a little bit of communication science. And this lecture that I'm talking about regarding stereotyping and othering comes from some teaching that I have done in the more media studies, gender, media, and diversity realm that I have worked in. Just as like to set this up, this is kind of a more middle of the term lecture with this class, with this lecture. I like to assign reading a book chapter by Stuart Hall that was written in 2003 called The Spectacle of the Other. And it's a bit of a challenging read. It's rather long, but students get a lot out of it, I think, because it's very well written and explains not just, you know, it's not just a laundry list of stereotypes, but rather how stereotypes are constituted and constructed, and how societally we work together to create this kind of construction of an other. And so that's what we'll be talking about today, the construction of stereotypes, and then talking about how these things become like common, how they become common representations of other people. So Stuart Hall in his reading talks about 4 different kinds of difference. And it's important to go over these different kinds of difference to really set up what the rest of the class will look like in thinking about stereotyping and othering. So first, Hall says, difference matters because it is essential to meaning. Without it, meaning could not exist. So this first definition is drawing on Saussure, a French philosopher, and talking about how meaning is relational. We can't understand something if we don't have boundaries around it. And so through binary oppositions, which are rather crude, we are able to understand one thing as not another thing. And this creates either or extremes that create a relational form of meaning. So this is a linguistic idea of difference. And it is rather reductionist, rather oversimplified, but it does give us a basic structure for how we understand differences between 2 things. This is then built on by another theory of difference. There's going to be 4. This is also coming from Saussure, but also from Bakhtin. And this is a dialogic or a social form of difference. So we need difference because we can only construct meaning through a dialogue with the other. And so I believe interpersonal communication is an introductory course for this program. And so it's important to understand how we have conversations with other people. A conversation, if you're in a conversation with one other person, that conversation is only half your own. Half of it also belongs to the other person and the meaning that they make out of it. And if there's multiple people in a conversation, you know, even less than half, a third, a fourth, a fifth. So it's a lot of different meanings being created at once that become a social difference. Stuart Hall talks about encoding and decoding. So how a source sends a message versus how a receiver receives that message. And decoding is particularly important in this difference because it is how we are understanding meanings in conversation and difference in conversation. And so in this difference, meaning of difference, difference can be relational and it can be constantly constructed in different ways. It can be negotiated. It's never fixed because we're having these different conversations that are constructed together in dialogue with someone else. In our third theory of difference, and our third approach, this is a more cultural approach to understanding difference. So culture depends on giving things meaning by assigning them to different positions within a classificatory system. The marking of difference is thus the basis of that symbolic order, which we call culture. So what Stuart Hall is saying here is that on a grander level, you know, the first difference we talked about was rather individual. I understand something as different from something else. And then we have an interpersonal. I understand difference because of the meaning I make with others. Now we're seeing these on a cultural organizational level. We understand difference because we set boundaries. And so this comes from anthropology, and it divides things into different classifications. So one of the interesting ways to think about this is in terms of binaries, but different kinds of binaries. So for example, we can divide food up as either raw or cooked, but we can also divide it as either fruits or vegetables. So it depends on your social classificatory system, how you understand the boundaries of what we think about as food. And so then discomfort arises when we think about things that you can have a grain, which is neither a fruit nor a vegetable. So what happens when you introduce gray to a black and white binary? And symbolic boundaries try to put things into these classifications, but as we might know, not everything fits into a perfect box. There's fluidity, and so it might not fit into these systems that we've grouped. And then these gray areas, that's where difference occurs. That is the difference that we cannot classify, and that then becomes a threat or a taboo. And then finally, we have our fourth approach to difference, which is the psychic approach, which draws on the French psychoanalytic work of Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan. Sigmund Freud has a quote that puts this into an easily understood perspective, which is, I always find it uncanny when I can't understand someone in terms of myself. And so Stuart Hall is saying the other is fundamental to the constitution of the self, to us as subjects, and to sexual identity. And so what is happening here is that we have to understand an other first in order to make meaning of ourselves. So we're going back to the individual level, but understanding it through a self-perception. So our subjectivities then that we have, the way we understand meaning, the way we understand each other, this is dependent on our unconscious relation with others, on how we view others who are separate from ourselves. And Frantz Fanon has extended this in talking about the Black subject versus the white subject, and white subjects rejecting a Black subject because it would mean that there is a white other. And so thinking about how groups of people, identities of people might understand themselves in relation to this other. So these are very high level theoretical definitions for difference, but we can kind of boil them down to, we understand difference by making boundaries. It's pretty well established in the social psychology literature that our brains can only handle so much at once. And so we have to classify things in order to make things easier. So classifying food, classifying people. And so understanding how we classify can help us understand how we create an other. And so these forms of difference give us a theoretical definition for understanding boundary making and relationality for the self and the other. And so now I'm going to turn this into, turn us towards a conversation of semiotics to better understand how the classification and other can then create a stereotype. So semiotics is the study of signs and symbols and their interpretations. And so this mostly comes from Saussure, but also Roland Barthes. And this is looking at how we make meaning of visual messaging. So the sign is the literal thing. So for example, a triangle, it is literally a triangle. Then we have the interpretant, which is all of the subjective filters, all of the relationality, the conversations that we've had, the culture that we are engaged in, the media messages that we consume, all of our subjective filters interpreting that literal thing into an object, a mental construct, something we understand as a triangle. And so the signal is the meaning that we derive from the sign. And so a really good example of this are these three triangular examples. They are all literally triangles. They are nothing more than a triangle. But because we have exposure to different media messages, exposure to advertising, we interpret these as the Triforce in The Legend of Zelda, a symbol for recycling, and the Adobe logo, rather than three different kinds of triangles in different colors. And so our culture, our media messages, our exposure to advertising, all of these different subjective filters tell us that these triangles mean something more than a shape with three sides and three angles. In a larger lecture, I would also go more into denotation, connotation, polysemy, and other forms of semiotics. Now we can think about why might this be relevant for a conversation on stereotyping and othering. Why would I give you these four big abstract theoretical ideas of difference and a miniature lecture on semiotics to understand stereotyping? And that's not a rhetorical question.
I would say it's because each individual has a different way of interpreting. And so we need to understand that process.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So each person has a separate set that they're already categorizing people as we meet them and then we put them together.
Yes. Are there other contributions, thoughts about semiotics and difference? That is fine, and you're on it. So the way that we understand interpretations, the way that we culturally engage with difference, shapes the way that we understand people and groups of people. And so this leads us into a conversation of Roland Barthes' myth. So the myth is common sense. This is different from mythology, although mythology very much can play into myth, but it's something that is taken for granted as understood within our dominant culture, within hegemony, within certain ideologies. So the differences that we construct within ourselves, with each other, with our cultures, these boundaries that we create and the meaning that we get out of certain subjects creates a common sense understanding. So one such example is the cowboy. So the idea of a cowboy as ruggedly individual and masculine is something that has been constructed for us by the media. It's not really necessarily like in historical accounts what a cowboy was like. And so, in fact, there's some really interesting research about like cowboy unions in the early West. And so this is something that has been created in our cultural representations and that cause us to interpret an image of a person with a cowboy hat and a lasso as hypermasculine, American, ruggedly individual. So we can analyze myth at 3 levels, and this is that denotation, connotation that I was saying I would get into if this was a longer lecture. And so Roland Barthes has these 2 examples in his work that really help us understand how our cultural subjectivities train us to read a message. So Roland Barthes is coming from a French perspective. And so thinking about France, we can think about red wine. And so this is literally an image of red wine being poured into a glass. It is nothing more than that. But that's the denotation. But the connotation of red wine, particularly in French culture, is one of a higher class and one of luxury and fashion and a feeling, a sense of richness. And so the myth that is constructed that goes beyond the connotation is that red wine is essential to French culture and is essential to being of a higher upper class and of living a life of desirability, regardless of the fact that red wine has health concerns linked to it, issues of heart disease, issues of alcoholism. These are irrelevant to the myth. What the myth creates is that red wine is desirable. And this becomes even more culturally impactful when we consider an image like this one. So this is the front page of a magazine. It's a magazine cover from a magazine called Paris Match. And what we literally see, the denotation, the sign, is a young Black boy saluting in a military uniform. That is what the image shows. But the connotation, his eyes looking upwards, the reverent salute, it's of honor, it's of reverence, it's of obedience, and it's of patriotism. And so the myth that it then creates, and this comes from Roland Barthes' work, is that the French military is honorable, and going even further in saying that French imperialism in the Northern African countries is a good thing, that colonialism is beneficial to young Black boys in Africa. So to bring this together, what we're saying here is that the ways that we experience difference, the ways that we understand boundaries and relationality shape our understanding of subjective interpretation. They shape our subjective interpretations. So when we are presented with an image or a media message, we process that through our subjective interpretations to get a message, one that is often intended in certain ways by media creators. So each image carries its own specific meaning, but at the broader level of how difference and otherness is being represented in a particular culture at any one moment, we can see representational practices and figures being repeated with variations from one text or site of representation to another. So this is a long-winded way of saying that one image of red wine on its own, one image of a Black boy saluting on a Paris magazine on its own is an image that we still get a meaning from. But what's important to consider is all of the images that we are getting about red wine, all of the images that we are getting about French imperialism in Africa. It's important to consider these in what's called a regime of representation. And so the regime of representation is the whole repertoire of images and visuals, and we can even go further. Stuart Hall and Roland Barthes are primarily talking about visuals, but we can go further to talk about textual representations, audio representations. The whole repertoire of representations that we are getting of a single group of people, a certain kind of person, to tell us what that kind of person looks like. And this also gets into a conversation of what's called intertextuality, which is how different visuals work together in order to create that regime of representation. And so this is where we really start seeing stereotype construction emerge. So if we see repeated images of, for example, in my own work on crime and media, repeated images of the hyper-masculine animalistic Black man, that will create a regime of representation that all Black men are hyper-masculine and animalistic and less human. So further into intertextuality, this is the example that Stuart Hall uses in the chapter that I assign. And so basically, this is saying that one image can rarely ever be decoded on its own. We understand these in a larger network of images. And so in this ad, which features Carl Lewis in an ad for Pirelli, the French reading in the ad, so this part in French, says power is nothing, or sorry, in Italian, says power is nothing without control. And so this ad is deeply subversive because of what I was just talking about. We have a regime of representation of Black men as hyper masculine and animalistic superhuman athletes. And so to place Carl Lewis in the high red heels creates this image of subversion that is subverting the idea of the hyper masculine and putting him in a traditionally feminine article of clothing. And so the image works by marking difference, by showing that the difference that we view Black men as is as hypermasculine, but we are signaling that we recognize that difference and subverting it. And so I like to give the example contemporarily because this is a rather old example and a bit difficult sometimes for students to connect to. Usually I show the music video, but I'm not going to even try to get that tech going. So here it would be a link to Harry Styles' music video for Watermelon Sugar. And I find this to be deeply related to intertextuality and subversion. So what do we know, if we know anything, which is fine if you don't, about Harry Styles?
Like engages in a performance of gender that complicates a lot of heteronormative and very hierarchical notions of masculinity, but I think also rubs up against the broader popular culture of commodifying sort of queer performance and queer baiting.
That's way more than I was expecting. It's probably more than I could have given. So yes. Exactly. Yeah, so Harry Styles is famous at this point for he's not famous for his gender fluidity and sexual fluidity in terms of performance, but he is well known that part of his performance plays into wearing a lot of women's clothing, not playing into a lot of hypermasculine trends, sexual ambiguity. He's been criticized for a lot of this because he doesn't really have a very public private life. So it's rather unclear whether those things are commodifications or authentic experiences of queerness. And we also, from his One Direction era, interestingly, it was kind of the opposite. You know, he was in this boy band, and even though it's like a quintessential Backstreet Boys and Sync-ish boy band, it still involved, you know, kind of a womanizer image. I think he dated Taylor Swift. And so he has these like very interesting relationships and visuals with the media that we are fed that show this kind of pushback against hypermasculinity. And so the Watermelon Sugar video, if you've never seen it, is very sexual. It's quite sexual. The song's quite sexual. And it's mostly a lot of like highly attractive, like conventionally attractive, Eurocentric looking women being sexual towards Harry Styles and towards each other as well. And so what's interesting, the reason that Watermelon Sugar, at least that I find that Watermelon Sugar does not get the kind of pushback that a video like Blurred Lines did, is because we have this intertextuality. We don't see Harry Styles as this kind of like hypersexual womanizer, because we see Harry Styles as floating between genders and floating between sexualities. And so there's a bit more of a pass. Had there not been Harry Styles's reputation of a gender nonconforming and sexually fluid image, this video, I believe, would likely have received the same outcry as Blurred Lines, because they're both essentially one guy being sexually advanced upon by numerous women. So to bring it back to stereotyping, Stuart Hall says that stereotype means reduced to a few essentials, fixed in nature by a few simplified characteristics. Stereotyping reduces, essentializes, naturalizes, and fixes difference. So the regime of representation, the many images that we get from the media and also from our own personal, your interactions in school, your interactions with your religious group, your interactions with your family, all of these different things that build your subjectivities, they create and craft differences and others, which are then supported by media images that fixate on certain aspects of a group to create a stereotype, whether intended or not. It is part of a larger body. So we understand the particular in terms of its type. So Hall gives this great example that, even though I've never seen this table before, I know it's a table. So I understand what goes into a table. And so we get the same thing about categories of people from our media messages. So even though I've not seen every image of a mom before, I know roughly what a mom looks like. And so I know what, if I'm looking at the image of a mom that a media representation is showing me, even if they don't have kids around, I can say, they're wearing kind of a t-shirt and jeans look. Maybe they have like a large purse that holds a lot of stuff, hair in a bun, stressed out. That might be a mom. So we get these ideas of a type of person. And so stereotypes are these types of people that mark difference. And then there's a clear connection between what we see in the visual to how we understand and classify groups of people. And so Stuart Hall, in his chapter, develops four different aspects of stereotyping. He talks about construction of otherness and exclusion. And so this is where we create those boundaries that we talked about from our initial way back when we had the abstract theories of difference, what we accept and what we reject, the black and white, and where does the gray sit. Stereotyping and power. So there's a certain power in representation, the ability to imagine, the ability to see yourself, the ability to make meaning of yourself is a form of power. The role of fantasy, and so how we invert kind of our unconscious fears. So there's often a trope in sitcoms of Black men as either childish or asexual, and this is a role of fantasy in avoiding the image of the traditionally understood Black man as hypersexual and animalistic. And then the role of fetishism, which I mentioned. I do a whole lecture usually on the role of fetishism in Quentin Tarantino films, and not necessarily the sexual fetish, but the objectification and fascination of certain parts rather than the whole. And so like Quentin Tarantino has this absolute fetish with the non-white people, with people of color, but with only certain aspects of that non-whiteness, rather than the whole of humanity of not being a white person. That matrix, those four aspects I've really simplified for this presentation, but they're outlined in this reading that I usually assign, and they're pretty interesting. And I usually ask students to try and apply them to stereotypes that they have seen, because it can be really fruitful in better understanding how stereotypes are constituted. And so, although we just talked about ways that intertextuality in the regime of representation can be subverted, this is often not the case. It's pretty rare for stereotypes to get subverted. They're generally pretty fixed. They focus on these like very, specific traits and exaggerate them, and it misses, the wholeness of the person. However, it's not all doom and gloom. There's many ways, like we talked about subversion, to reverse stereotypes and try to counter stereotypes. And this is what's really important for media practitioners to think about. And this is what I encourage my students. I like to give an assignment where I ask students to identify a problem that they see in the media, like a stereotype in a sitcom or something like that, and to try and fix it and try to see what they can do to make the problem better. And this is one of the ways that we can do it. So because meaning is relational, it's made in conversation, it's made in culture, it's made within ourselves, it doesn't have to be fixed. It can never be fixed. It can always be negotiated. And so what can we do? Stuart Hall talks about transcoding, which is taking an existing meaning and reappropriating it for a new meaning. So in this way, he gives 3 examples. The first is reversing the stereotype. So take what exists. So the Pirelli ad, the Carl Lewis ad, take what exists, this animalistic superhuman image of a Black man, and reverse it. Add just high heels, and you've really combated some of that image to create a subversive image. This can be successful, but it can also leave the other in a binary. You either are or you are not, hypermasculine or not hypermasculine. And so it's not necessarily overturning it or even subverting it in a complete way, but it is turning it around, like reversing it. Substituting this with the positive, substituting the stereotype with the positive. So if we see a lot of negative images in the media of a certain group, substituting it with positive images, celebrating difference, the range of experience, the wholeness of a person, the complexity of representation. This can be really successful. We can see plenty of shows, for example, something like the later seasons of the show Glow, which have a lot of dynamic women of color, and they have large plot lines in that story. But it can also be kind of a masking of reality. So there's this great article that I also like to assign my students about Hamilton and the casting of actors of color and roles in Hamilton, which is, as the author says, dipping white characters in chocolate and not showing dynamic people of color as characters. Also, it can get into this burden of representation where one person, one character, one group of characters is responsible for showing the wholeness of an entire group, which can also be very difficult and in fact impossible. And then finally, contesting from within. So making the stereotypes work against themselves. And that's where I have this example here. So these photos come from E.J. Brown's collection called Mugshot Series. And they take the pretty traditional image that we see in the media of young Black men in mugshots and change them. It's pretty difficult to see, but it shows the date that they graduated from college and what their major is. And so subverting the image to show, using the stereotype against itself, and it incorporates ideas of ambivalence. People can be many things at once, or they could be nothing. And so incorporating many different feelings into one image. And what's ultimately very important is representing people as individuals. So one person cannot stand in for a whole group. One person cannot be all moms. One person cannot be all teachers. One person cannot be all any group. And so representing people as individuals and letting them exist as individuals. And there's actually some pretty interesting examples from like Fresh Off the Boat where oh, I'm blanking on her name now. It's fine. So the lead actress, she's talked about Constance Wu has talked about using an accent on Fresh Off the Boat and people criticizing her for using an accent. And she says, I'm trying to represent my mom, and this is how my mom speaks. And she said that in her memoir and has pushed back against people saying, I'm not trying to represent all Chinese immigrants, I'm trying to represent my mom. And so there's some really interesting conversations there. So the last thing that I will talk about, I'll wrap this up, is questions that I encourage my students to ask themselves. In a lot of conversations about representation, about ethics, we talk about, is it good or is it bad? And we just can't look at media that way. Media is essentially value neutral, and we imbue value into it. We make it good, we make it bad. Our interpretations play an enormous role in how we understand media messages and the regime of representation. So when thinking about stereotypes, and now we've talked about how they are constructed through making difference and othering, through our interpretation of signs, through the creation of common sense and myth, and through these different forms of coding and intertextuality, we can think about these questions instead, rather than is it good or is it bad? We can ask questions like, what does it naturalize? This depiction of a person, Constance Wu's character in Fresh Off the Boat, what does that depiction naturalize? What does it make normal? What is it, the narrative that's being told here? What's the impact? Of the many meanings that you could get out of this visual, what do you think the source wants you to get? Which meaning is privileged in this visual, in this story, in this TV show, in whatever media artifact you are looking at? What do you think is intended? And then what do you think people get out of it? So thinking about different ways of understanding representation beyond, is this a good representative or a bad representative? Rather, what is this representative doing? Why is it doing that? And what else could or should it be doing? And so that is all I have for you. I hope you learned a little something on stereotyping and othering. There you go. I'd love to answer questions.
So I guess this is from more of a psychological perspective, is like stereotyping and othering more of something like, I mean, I got it from your presentation, more of something we kind of just go about on a daily basis without even realizing what we're doing? Or is there a more conscious level to it? Because when it comes to media, the people putting together those different forms of media are obviously very aware of what they're doing. So how does that like?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. So at the risk of a non-answer, it's a little of both. I mean, there is clear like social psychological research that says we classify things. Like it would be impossible to hold all the knowledge of the universe in our brains at once. So we have to put things into boxes to better understand it. Like these are all tables. And so part of it is unconscious. It's just a reaction. I know my mom is in the classification of moms. And so part of it is just us making our own lives easier to process things with mental tricks. And that is not inherently bad. Like there are a lot of things that need to be classified, and classifications help us in a lot of different ways. I would encourage you to think about, not everything that is done in the media is as intentional as you might think. We draw on a lot of our own experiences. And so if my experience, my cultural creations of difference, my interpretations of other forms of difference have always shown me that the boss is a man, then if I go into creating a television show and I default to creating the boss as a man, that's not necessarily because I think that women can't be bosses, but it's because my mental classification has told me that, the myth is that men are bosses. And so that is not, an intentional exclusion of women or other genders as leaders, but rather a unconscious processing using my typification of what a boss is. And there is certainly intentional stereotyping. I don't want to say that there's not. There are absolutely stereotypes that are used for malicious or non-malicious reasons. And so media creators do sometimes play into stereotypes somewhat on purpose. Sometimes it's meant to be satirical and maybe it doesn't land, or maybe it is that someone doesn't believe that a woman can be in charge or something like that. And so they're playing into this. on purpose because their stereotype of a boss is a man, or of a woman is not as a leader. And so it can be that way, but oftentimes these are, the result of a lifetime of messages that come from the media and from our existence in a social existence. Like, we are social people, and so it comes from like a lifetime of exposure to different things that often become unconscious. And so part of the importance of talking about difference and myths and othering is to try to bring more attention to our own perception of stereotypes.
Yeah, so I appreciated your discussion about Hamilton and some of the challenges and really kind of difficult, nuanced territory of this representation of historical figures through kind of, using more diverse cast and representation. I don't know if you're familiar or have seen like Queen Charlotte and the broader kind of Bridgerton universe, right? But there's this similar discussion of, casting racially diverse performers into roles that, historically is like representing figures that are white, but there's also this space of, at least the Queen Charlotte show addresses this kind of alternate history where there is quote unquote an experiment involving Black landowners that explains some of the racial diversity. So there's like an in-universe explanation. All that to say, this question of representation of historical figures in the context of racial diversity and this kind of treacherous terrain of supporting performers and actors in these roles who otherwise wouldn't have these opportunities to be included, but also this kind of, like you're saying, almost like a like the phrase you used was dipping white people in chocolate, right? This challenging, almost whitewashing of, or I don't know how you even describe it, but representation of history. I'm curious to hear a bit more about your perspective and the representational challenges and its implications for your work here.
Yeah, I love talking about this. So there's I assign it every opportunity I get. There's an essay, I think it's only like 6 pages, by Kristen Warner called "In the Time of Plastic Representation." And it's like 6 pages and most of those are pictures. So it's an easy read. And I got to see her speak once at ICA in Paris and talk about this paper. And the idea of what she coins plastic representation. So plastic being, synthetic and malleable and fake. And she talks about Hamilton in particular and says this like dipping white characters in chocolate, because she's talking about specifically characters that are white, that are written white. And these can be fictitious characters as well. But that are built around the white experience and white storylines and living as a white person, but then casting somebody who is not white. So it's a white story that is represented by a person who's not white. So it's not representing a not white experience and a not white story, a not white history. And so Hamilton is particularly egregious of this because these are real historical figures that really oppressed and brutalized Black people. And so it misses a lot of that story by focusing on having, a visually colorful cast is the phrase that she uses, a visually colorful cast, but a white storyline. And so it gets back to that idea of representing people as individuals and their individual experience. So, Constance Wu representing her mom and her mom's individual experience is speaking to a Chinese immigrant story rather than a white mom who is played by a Chinese woman. And so that is the kind of direction and representation conversations that in my classes I like to have and that I like to get into, which is, what does it mean to have a white story that's told by somebody else, or to have a multitude of stories that are told by a multitude of cast members.
Great, thank you. All right, thank you so much.
You're welcome. I had fun.
Again, Dr. Tabor will be giving a research presentation at 2 p.m. in Sacramento 4. I appreciate students and everybody coming by to here, and we will, just a little bit, we'll do lunch.
Great. I'm gonna be talking prisons in my research talk, in case that sells anyone. Uh-huh.
Kevin, did you decide where we're headed for lunch?
I think so. Why don't we, have them on see this?
That sounds great, yeah.
And then, Jeanette's here.
I'm Jeanette.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to meet you.
You too.
Why don't we,
Good luck with you guys.
why don't we ride? What's that?
You're going to lunch.
Yes, why don't we ride? Is your car around? Can you guys ride?
Yeah, I'm able to drive.
Okay.
Yeah, my vehicle's right here as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll go with someone and Jim's gonna pick me up.
Oh, okay. Yeah, why don't we go together
Okay.
in the, and we'll take Corey's car. Maybe we could, we have some time, maybe we can top it out on 84, see what we can do. She says it'll do 180, I doubt it.
I'll say.
Just kidding, just, but
So,
we'll just meet you down there.
okay,
Is
yeah,
that-
so you're gonna take Brittany out and, meet you there?
Yeah, does
Yeah,
that work?
sounds great.
Yeah.
Great.
Does it take 2 cars?
Yeah. Cool. Oh, yeah. Thanks for coming by, and I'm glad that class was canceled. Yeah. I appreciate it. Yeah, so the student my class too. It sounds like it's gonna be in a class that started at 11.
Yeah.
Class canceled, I'm like, you should come here. And like, yeah.
Is this the Zoom? Is that still?
Oh, good point, because that will keep going for hours and